I was asked for a title for this lecture, and I gave a fairly lofty and highbrow one, which now it's my burden to fulfill. This summer, I gave about 32 talks out west, one downtown here at the bookstore, and I have those down, but now I'm pushing myself out of my comfort zone because it's such a lofty title, The Future of the American West, which I'm going to describe for you here, and you're going to say, oh, that guy from Worcester, Massachusetts, he really knows the future of the American West. And that's what's going to happen. And my wife, one thing I like to do at my talks in bookstores is talk. My wife's a writer. Right now, she's speaking in Chapel Hill about her novel, The Last September, which, as a quick aside, nothing to do with the future of the American West, it's a murder mystery love story where the main character is killed by a schizophrenic brother. I have a schizophrenic brother, and my family is not very happy about the book. And she said, she's very wise about the ways of writing. I mentioned in Rick's class that she had said to me, and I write about real people, so they hate me even more. She said to me, if you write about people and say they're brilliant, good-looking, and profound, and occasionally get in bad moods, they're going to be very upset about the bad moods part. It's just the way it works. But she's also said to me along the way that writers come and do these readings. And we've been trained since we were very young to be read to and go to sleep. And so, in general, I don't read. Tonight, bearing the burden of the future of the American West, I will be walking over to the podium, and if you really can't hear me in the back, which is that, I can't believe that's true, but maybe it is. But if you can't, I will be very loud over there with the microphone. But I'm going to start with kind of a personal story. I, in a way, was born in the West, at least in Mr. Thoreau's terminology, or as what he used, because he was from Concord, and he would look west toward Wachusett Mountain, which is near Worcester, Massachusetts, my hometown. And during touring the West this summer, I would ask people, and I always got surprising answers, how many people had either been to, or God knows lived in, or spent any time in Worcester, Massachusetts. Okay, not that many as usual, but it's always shocking to me that the West is well represented in Worcester, or as we call it, the town's nickname back home, Wormtown. I don't know why it's called that, but it is. But it makes sense, I won't go into that. So in a weird way, this book about the West begins in Worcester, because I grew up there, escaped from there, moved to Boston, and thought I was free of Worcester. And then when I was 29, my girlfriend got into medical school at UMass Worcester. And we moved back there. And there's a great book, very underrated book, by Douglas Day, about the novelist Malcolm Lowry, who wrote Under the Volcano. And there's a quote in it, which I'm going to paraphrase. I don't have it at hand. But it's basically, we always underestimate the power that bad places have when you return to them. It's shocking the emotional power these places have. And so I said to my girl, in fact, I argued my girlfriend out of going to NYU and said, yeah, we'll go to Worcester. We'll live in the country out, like there was country outside of Worcester, and it'll be great. Well, it wasn't great. I imploded. I sunk into like the sinkhole of self. I got a job as a substitute teacher. I was trying to work on a novel. I just lost all momentum. I'd never published a book at that point. I lost all momentum in my life. And that was before I found out I had testicular cancer. And I'm not looking for sympathy here. In fact, I wrote in my journal, I don't know what's worse, cancer or Worcester. And let's just say I had a really bad fall in winter. And the only good thing I did during that period was, and the only burst of energy, and more, having had that experience, I think energy and momentum and I'll get to that with Stegner and Abbey, are so key, not just to productivity, but to what passes for happiness in this world, pushing things. And so I pushed things for 1 month or a couple weeks, and I pushed applying for creative writing programs. I'd written 2 bad novels in my 20s where the characters would quote Thoreau to each other, and no one wanted to read these novels. But I applied to creative writing programs in November, maybe December, and then I came back from a pickup basketball game in January, had been kneed in the groin, and it didn't get better. So I went in to the doctor, and to my surprise, he didn't say, "Oh, put some ice on it and relax." He said, "We got to get in there next week." And I did not like the phrase "in there." But we got in there, and I then had a month of radiation in Worcester in the month of April. So I thought, of course, it's T.S. Eliot, April is the cruelest month. And the spring was blooming, and I was getting more and more depressed. And this is a long-winded way, I know, to get to Abbey and Stegner. But what happened that month is the 5 programs I'd applied to, I methodically got rejected one by one from those programs, and got more depressed. And the last letter, back when we had letters, was from the University of Colorado Boulder, and I got in. And I call it my deus ex machina of my young life. I was suddenly airlifted from Worcester to Boulder. And I have one line I'd like to read of Ed Abbey's somewhere over here, which I think I'll come back and do the longer readings here, but I'm going to do this for you guys. I want to keep center stage here. So I knew suddenly, I had hope. I was getting healthier, and I was feeling better, and by now it's May. I'm starting to run and jog a little bit, and I'm starting to feel a little better. And then August comes, and I talked to my dad, and I said, "I've got to get out to Colorado." And my brother had an unregistered Buick Electra in New York City. And my dad said, "You can take that." But my dad was kind of a world-wise kind of businessman character, and he said, "Don't register it here. Register it in Colorado so you don't have to register it twice." So I drove an unregistered Buick Electra across the country out to Colorado. And I had, it's very politically incorrect. I don't see a lot of really young people except maybe one over there. But I drank coffee all morning as I drove west, and then I sipped, swill beer as I kept going. And I think I did it in 2 days most of the trip. And the third morning I got up and I saw the Rockies, and I had been very unemotional about the cancer until then. And it was this moment of, oh my God, I've got this new second life. And I said in the book, had John Denver himself come on the radio, I would have warbled along, And I think that's I don't know how many of you, and I don't want to do hand raising throughout, but how many of you are Montana born and bred, and how many have the West as a second home? But certainly for Americans in general, the movement west and that archetypal moment is a huge one. And this is what Ed Abbey said when he went hitchhiking west from his home in Home, Pennsylvania, when he was 16, or 17 actually. There on the western horizon, under a hot, clear sky, 60 miles away, crowned with snow in July, was a magical vision, a legend come true, the front range of the Rocky Mountains, an impossible beauty, like a boy's first sight of an undressed girl. The image of those mountains struck a fundamental chord in my imagination that has sounded ever since. It's typical of Abbey to compare it to an undressed girl, as we know. And I don't know that I felt quite the archetypal joy that he felt when I moved to El Dorado Springs in 1991, I think it was. But I started hiking the trails. Then I learned that in Boulder it was against the law not to be in shape, so I started running the trails and biking the trails. But Bernard DeVoto had a great term. Bernard DeVoto, this great Western writer, spent almost his entire adult life in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he had a line when he moved there. He called himself an apprentice New Englander. And I called myself that year an apprentice Westerner. But I was even more specific than that. I was a subset of, I was an apprentice literary Westerner. And all these books, all of a sudden Terry Tempest Williams was on my bedside in Cadillac Desert, and Rick Bass, and I was learning my place, but I was also reading my place. But of all those, the king, no doubt, was Desert Solitaire, which I was reading that year. And when I went back to see El Dorado Springs at the beginning of my trip that became the book, of course, the Ranger had Desert Solitaire beside her. This was in 2012. But I really felt, for me, those lines in Desert Solitaire, and I know we've all felt it very personally, were lines that resonated, like famously, on this bedrock of animal faith, I take my stand, and I am here to evade for a while the clamor and filth and confusion of the cultural apparatus, but not only to evade the clamor, filth, and confusion of the cultural apparatus, but also to confront immediately and directly, if possible, the bare bones of existence, the elemental and fundamental, the bedrock which sustains us. And simply breathing in a place like this arouses the appetite. I love the way the sentences rang out, an anthem, or so it seemed to me, of my own return to animal health. And that was the beginning of 7 great years in Colorado. And Abbey did a lot of things, as I'm sure he's done. You're here, and you're not here for Gessner, that's for sure. You're here for Abbey and Stegner. And one of the things that Abbey did, unknowingly or surprisingly, is he proved a gateway drug to Stegner for me. Suddenly, the next year, I wasn't just gobbling up the obvious books. I was reading Wallace Stegner, and the more I read him, the more excited I got. Because this was a new way of seeing for me. And it really, I'm going to go a little into Stegner's biography here because I think it's relevant. I'm sure, Abbey is one archetype of the West. The guy who comes from the East, sees those mountains, and is born again. Stegner is born in the West. And Stegner lives this migrant Western childhood where he's moving from the Dakotas to Washington State, to Saskatchewan, to Great Falls, to Salt Lake, and he's being pushed all the time by a person he later sees as this archetypal Western figure, his father, George Stegner. George really gave the name to his first big book, not his first book, Big Rock Candy Mountain, because George is always looking beyond the horizon, and he's trying to find the place for the next big boom, whether it's land, uranium, tourism, whatever it is, the next strike. And Stegner, who really gave us the language that we all use now of boomers and nesters, sees in his father the classic boomer. And he sees, and this, Wendell Berry was my first stop as I traveled west in Kentucky, and Wendell Berry said to me, remember, while his father was doing that, his mother was planting perennial flowers and always hoping that would be the next home. So he's got these two poles, and there's no question, even though as a novelist he tries to be fair to both, like an Angle of Repose, there's no question what side Wally came down on. The mom is the figure. I was talking earlier, I think, to Rick about a moment in Stegner's life when he was about 6, and he'd been in an orphanage in Washington State because his dad went up to look for gold in Alaska. And his mom finally could afford to get them into a tent in Washington State. And they had to walk down a path to an outhouse. And when the dad came home, Wally didn't make it all the way down the path and took a crap basically in the woods. And the father found it and rubbed his face in it. So and as I say that, I feel like I'm in the modern age of memoir, what a bad dad. But the bad dad had also virtues. He was full of energy, he could build things. As Wallace Stegner said, he belonged on the frontier 40 years before. But out of that father, Stegner kind of developed an image of the Westerner against the cliche image, against the rugged individualist. Saskatchewan was their big dream place. And they farmed there until, of course, drought drove them out, right? So that, for him, was a moment of kind of his one little window of ideal childhood. And the thing that drove him out was aridity. And aridity would be a theme he would play over and over again. I'll just read one short paragraph, which I think we'll all agree is pretty prophetic, but also is pretty emblematic of this summer we're in. Stegner would later write, "The history of the West until recently has been the history of the importation of human land habits and carelessness into a dry land that will not tolerate them, and of the indulgence of an unprecedented personal liberty," he saw his dad there, "an atomic individualism in a country that experience says can only be successfully tamed and lived in by a high degree of cooperation. Inherited wetland habits have given us a damaged domain." You know, he was saying these things 50 years ago that we're saying with the California drought and with our own droughts this summer. So he was on that. And he knew it instinctively growing up, moving around from place to place. He knew that transience was a big part of the Western experience. But two things in his life kind of heightened and kind of solidified that early experience. The first was he went to grad school in Iowa when he was a very young man. He always said he would have been content to stay in Salt Lake City and sell linoleum flooring. But an English teacher saw promise and got him a scholarship in Iowa, so he went to Iowa. And a big moment for him was he'd always said, I am very envious of my friends who have homes. I never had a home. And the first moment, and he recreates this fictionally in Big Rock Candy Mountain, where he felt the sense of home was when he drove back from Iowa back to Salt Lake. And I'm going to read, because this has the title, The Future of the American West. I'm going to read, but this is in fact, I'll do it with the mic in case people can't really hear me back there. It was on the drive back from Iowa that his eyes began to open. The fictional portrayal of that return home is one of the climactic scenes of the novel, The Big Rock Candy Mountain. As he leaves Iowa behind, the young Bruce Mason, modeled on the young Wallace Stegner, finds himself questioning the whole idea of home. He curses his father's vagabond instincts and wishes he was going home to a place where, quote, the associations of 22 years were collected together. Bruce envies those who have lived in only one place, and as he drives, he ties himself into knots, all but convincing himself that the notion of home doesn't really exist. But then suddenly, the land rises and starts to take on a familiar look. The air grows drier, the towns farther apart, the colors more sere and less green. It is then that it occurs to Stegner that for him home is not a particular house or town, but an entire region. He settles on a new definition of himself. He was a Westerner, whatever that was. What did that mean exactly? Different things to different people, of course. But it would fall to Stegner, and in many ways was his life's work, to clarify what it meant most. Scale is the first and easiest of the West lessons, he would write. And by that he meant getting used to the larger, less cozy, inhuman scale of the natural world in the West. Similar to this idea, but slightly different, is the concept of space. In the West, this is a quote, in the West it is impossible to be unconscious or indifferent to space, he wrote. Space, quote, continues to suggest unrestricted freedom, unlimited opportunity for testings and heroism, a continuing need for self-reliance and physical competence. By space, he meant the distance between things, people, buildings, towns. Space lent people the dignity of rareness. Then there was the look of the place, a look that could take a while for a non-Westerner to appreciate. Colors and forms are harder, he said, and they are for those raised to see comfort in green. Of course, the reason things aren't green is because they are dry, and dryness was a note Stegner played over and over in defining his home region. He also realized something else about the West. A lot of the living took place outdoors. The home he was returning to was a place of constant physical challenge and hardship. It rose up, Stegner often said, like a dare. So this was a big event for him. And characteristically, one of my favorite Stegner quotes is, "Largeness is a lifelong matter." I think he meant this personally in terms of being magnanimous and trying to grow beyond what he was. He had his flaws. When your face is smeared in the shit when you're a little kid, there's some bitterness left over and some stubbornness and some troubles. So he had his flaws, but he strove to grow beyond them and be magnanimous. But intellectually, he really started to put big picture things together. He put aridity, snowpack. He put the tendency of kind of the rapacious development that he'd seen in his father, and that kind of hit a place and then leave the place. He started to put this big picture together, and it was really characteristic of his mind and one of my favorite aspects of Stegner. And then later on, after he'd had a little lull in his novel writing career, he wrote a biography of John Wesley Powell. And I think this was a huge moment for him. I'm sure most of you know who John Wesley Powell is or was, but he went down the Grand Canyon in the late 1800s, the first European to go down through with his group, and he became kind of a national celebrity. But characteristic of Powell, he didn't bask in it. He went back and took that celebrity and used it in Congress to try to fight through for a comprehensive land plan for the West that was based on the reality of the West, the aridity, the need to share water, irrigation. And it's really interesting to read about this now. I give it a cursory take in my book. I would really recommend other books like Beyond the 100th Meridian, Stegner's book, because basically what he's doing in the late 1800s is fighting a climate-denying Congress. And it's fascinating to watch him do that with facts. And I think Stegner, in writing it, saw himself. He said of Powell that he had a broader, generalizing imagination, but he also had an adherence to fact. So I think Stegner saw himself in Powell. And what Stegner did in the next few years is both Abbey and Stegner, and I know I'm not giving Abbey his fair share quite yet, but both of them, it's important to remember, saw themselves primarily as writers. They really had still the Hemingway model, like the Great American Novel. And so it's fascinating what they did as a secondary priority environmentally. And what Stegner does, in part because Devoto pushes him, and in part probably because of writing about Powell, is he starts writing these articles that lead to him going into with Stuart Udall, with Kennedy, into the Kennedy administration, and writing a lot of the early writing that will lead to the Wilderness Act, which is, if you're like me and you're an environmental writer now who writes these little books, you're like, holy crap, what this person was impacting the world in such a way. There's a great line, Bruce Babbitt, this is what he said about reading Beyond the 100th Meridian. When I first read Beyond the 100th Meridian, shortly after it was published in 1954, it was as though someone had thrown a rock through the window. Stegner showed us the limitations of aridity and the need for human institutions to respond in a cooperative way. He provided me in that moment with a way of thinking about the American West, the importance of finding true partnership between human beings and the land. I mean, that's a Secretary of the Interior reading a book, it's like, and having his mind blown by it. And that's exciting stuff. I mean, I think a lot of this for us now is common knowledge. We think of these things, but part of the reason we think about those things is because he and Devoto and others were there before. Since my talk, as I keep reminding you, is about the future of the American West, I'm going to read a little part when I drove up to Paonia, Colorado, and had this just kind of, for a middle-aged person, a rare kind of ecstatic experience of seeing the aspens and just really excited. But it's funny how when you go into the natural world now, you both have that kind of glorious moment if you're lucky sometimes, and then you have doom over here. And I was giving a lot of talks this summer, and a young environmentalist said to me, well, aren't you always really depressed when you're walking out there? I was like, well, no. I mean, I'm walking out there having a great time and enjoying it, but thinking about it maybe later, I get a little depressed. So this was after having one of those great moments. I had a less great moment. Perhaps in times ahead, reveling, or at least sustained reveling, will get harder. Perhaps it will become more difficult to ignore darker truth, to stop ourselves from seeing things, ugly things that deflate us. Some of these are the very same ones that Wallace Stegner warned of, but some are things that he never had to worry about during his lifetime. For instance, he did not have to worry about those millions, did I say millions? Sorry, billions, of pine bark beetles chewing up the innards of pines and spruce throughout the West. He did not have to worry about dust. Oh, he did have to worry about dust. Any Westerner did. But he did not have to worry about winter regularly ending earlier and massive clouds of man-created dust covering the thinning snowpack and transforming it from a reflective white shield into a darkened heat absorber, heat that, along with the beetles, abetted the massive destruction of western trees. And finally, while he might have been saddened by the loss of those trees, his sadness would not likely have focused on seeing that loss as a part of the cycle of increased atmospheric CO2, the loss not just of beauty, but of storehouses of carbon. Of course, Stegner knew the basics. More than the basics, he knew the fundamentals. And he had an uncanny knack for putting those fundamentals together to see the big picture. But he didn't have our fundamentals. The puzzle might be the same, but some of the pieces are brand new. In these days, the few who can really put pieces together the way Stegner could are frankly scared stiff. The picture is as simple as it is scary. One equation goes like this: high temps plus beetles plus less snow plus darker snow plus more fires plus more carbon in the air equals what? No one knows exactly. Perhaps the scariest thing of all that most scientists currently studying the landscape say that the recent rash of fires and floods, drought and dust bowls are not aberrational. That they were common enough before climate change ratcheted things up another couple of degrees, which means that rather than treat these events as freaks, it is better to consider them the cyclical norm. It is now foolish to regard a normal year as one without disaster. It would be wrong to see a silver lining in the current cycle of drought in the West. There is none. But at least drought can sometimes force us to see things as they are. In flusher times, there are parts of the West that can whistle along and ignore reality, pretending to be something they're not. But that will soon be impossible. We will be forced to strip away our illusions, to prepare ourselves as much as possible for what is to come. So now I'm depressed. And so it's time to turn to Abbey, who said, as Wendell Berry reminded me, he said, enough with saving the world, it's time to go down the river. And I think one of the reasons we still read Abbey, and he was very schooled in Devoto and Stegner, and he was people always ask me, what's the big surprise in doing this? And I guess one surprise would be Stegner's stubbornness, and he had a hard streak that I didn't really know about. But the surprise with Abbey is how intellectual he was to read through his journals, and how damn smart he was, despite obviously, part of the cliche of the book is contrasting these two. I said at one point I could write a whole chapter on their different hairstyles. The white, perfect, not hair out of place, and the wild, shaggy. And there's a sense of Abbey, the cliche of Abbey, misogynist, racist possibly, 5 wives and 5 kids. But there's some things about him that are important to me still. And one is the fact that I would even say, barring Thoreau, barring anybody, he writes about the physical landscape in a way that for me makes me want to get out into it still. In a virtual time, he still, I'll read a quote of his, he still excites in that way. I would say that a lot of the things he did back then, when I moved to Boulder, people were still, cutting down billboards, and I'd never seen literary influence at work the way I saw in Abbey. People would read him and suddenly be doing acts of terrorism around the world. So that was exciting back then. But of course, we're in a post 9/11 world where if you did half of what Abbey did, you'd end up in jail, right? I mean, that's just the fact of it. So what is, assuming that Stegner is providing us with this kind of intellectual scaffolding, what is Abbey still giving us? And I'm sure some of you probably can answer that. But for me, it's the power of symbol, the power of boldness. There was a great, I had a great interview with an FBI agent in Grand Junction, and she said, and I said to her, what if you were a young, passionate environmentalist, what would you do now? You couldn't cut down billboards, you couldn't drive a bulldozer into the Grand Canyon, you couldn't do these things. What would you do now? And she said, you realize I'm an FBI agent, I can't really answer that question. And I said, well, okay. And then ultimately she kind of circled back to it. And she said, I would do the opposite. The essence of monkey wrenching was being secretive. You'd only tell one other person or two at the most. I would film it. I would do, whale wars. I would reclaim the story and videotape the destruction that's occurring, which is the opposite in a way of what Abbey was doing, but it's also the same, and that it relies on that kind of power of symbol and boldness. I also think that, I'm not going to go into, I can during the Q&A about what a bad man Abbey may or may not have been, but there's a refreshing aspect of honesty. And obviously one aspect of honesty is humor. I mean, Abbey famously said of Gary Snyder's work, I like it very much except for all the Zen bullshit. And Gary Snyder might not have liked that very much, but they remained friends. He said of writing, and this is maybe, we're not the youngest crowd in the world, we're not the oldest either, but I'm going to go for it anyway. He said of writing for National Geographic that he hated the restraints and the word count and everything. He said it's like trying to jerk off in ski gloves. He was, Wallace Stegner, he was not. And it's refreshing to have that too. And for me, that aspect was big. Usually I read this section from the book that because of our title tonight, I'm not going to read, which is about literary immortality, which is a very out of vogue, topic. I said this at Rick's class, there's no literary immortality. When the supernova hits, no one's going to remember Shakespeare, right? We know that. And if anybody's immortal, we think, well, it's Shakespeare. Because we have his plays still going, and that was 500 years ago. And I always go back 50 years before and say, for me, my man is Montaigne, writing his essays in France. And the reason he's immortal for me is when I first read those, even though he was 500 years dead, I felt like I was having a conversation with this person. He was very much alive to me. And that was because I felt his mood shift. I felt him say one thing and contradict it. I felt his personality on the page. One of my favorite quotes is by Emerson about Montaigne, and he says, cut his sentences and they bleed. And this is a quote that I apply to Abbey. It's a rare act. When I talk to you, I'm waving my arms around, making some eye contact. It's a rare act to be able to make words on the page convey a personality. And that's kind of, to me, his genius, and that's why he sticks around. And I always say he excelled at kind of the Monty Python school of humor, like thinking philosophical thoughts and stepping in dog shit. And he really was brilliant at not Dumb and Dumber, but Smart and Dumber. In 3 sentences, he could be waxing eloquent about a juniper tree and having philosophical thoughts, and then talking about the crudest thing. And that's kind of genius in a way, to move in that way. So I think one thing he does, Stegner, I think, brings to the current world a way to think in a big picture way. Remember, largeness is a lifelong matter of connecting the dots and thinking about the big picture West. Abbey brings kind of a refreshing boldness, honesty, and courage that is exciting to me. I'm going to read from the end of the book first about these things that I was just talking about, and then about their deaths, which, as you probably know, were fairly dramatic. And then I'm going to take a break. In fact, because I'm tired of talking I'm going to do a little Q&A before I do that last reading. My mouth's a little dry. So let's just do it. This we'll call this the intermediate Q&A. Yeah.
So, Mary Cloud Evans, and I come from an old Western family. I'm sure everybody likes to do their pedigrees, but one of the things I think is interesting between Abbey and Stegner for me is that it's funny that you say that Stegner came down on his father's side because it's his women I associate with, versus Abbey, who I find his women very foppish and sort of useless, whereas, you know, to me a Western woman, particularly a pioneer woman, is very, very practical, has a backbone, and can actually do something.
Well, it's interesting that, as a lot of you probably know, that Angle of Repose, which is a great character, female character, and also the book that he was most criticized for. And do you guys know about this, more or less? That he was, it's a brilliant book. In fact, one game we played this summer at various stops is name your top 5, of Abbey Stegner. And it's funny how it's hard to dislodge Desert Solitaire. But obviously, we come in with Angle of Repose, and you're right, the female characters are much more complex. Though he got so much crap for that, because he essentially, the thing is, he would supposedly plagiarize letters for that character. Well, I'd always defended it, because as an artist, I'm like, of course we steal from everywhere. And then I read the letters, and I was like, holy shit, he's doing this word for word. So no wonder he created a great female character. He used the great, but I think he, it's a little off your point, but I think he existed really in a moral universe. So for instance, in Crossing to Safety, where you have 2 very strong female characters, they exist in that same universe. And everybody, the moral stakes are high. I mean, I wrote in the book that for me, so much of Abbey's fiction, which I want to love, is very cartoony. And it's not just the men that are cartoony, the women, I mean, it's not just the women that are cartoony, the men. But a classic example of Ed probably not doing what he hoped to do is the Monkey Wrench Gang. For writers, almost every character is written in the third person, the close third person. So when Doc Sarvis is thinking something, you get this kind of intellectual, curmudgeonly, Abbey-like character. When Hayduke is thinking something, it's like, fuck, blow something up, But when Bonnie is thinking something, you get an external thing looking in and talking about her breast and how hot she is, basically. So, he had his limitations, for sure, in terms of creative. And Stegner, Wallace Stegner's mom's last words were, "You're a good boy, Wallace." So, I mean, it's, for me, it's like the good boy and the not so good man, over here. And I didn't say this since we're talking about the future of the American West, but this is a very personal book for me that was originally titled Properly Wild. I had just turned 50, and my personal question, my memoiristic question was, can I be a good man and a wild man as I traveled west, and my daughter was with me a little bit of the trip. And these guys were the poles that I thought about. I'm a professor and blah, blah, blah. It's like, how can you be good and wild at the same time is the real driving question of the book for me. And I see a lot in both of them possibly. So.
Do you see any improvement in attitude in the West with fracking, coal mining, overgrazing, has it changed for the positive or negative since Stegner resigned?
I think that both men would be deeply depressed by the current state of things. That said, I think there are quite a few enlightened pockets, and there's been actual enlightened action, and there's much more general awareness that these things can do damage. Now that hasn't stopped a lot of them from doing damage. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I think they would see their darker prophecies fulfilled to some extent. But here we are sitting in this room. I almost feel silly repeating to Westerners, the litany of aridity and these things. So this is a common language we have. So in a way, they created a counter narrative that was continued and is continued to this day. So there's positive there. I hate to use the word hope because all environmentalists, they go on for an hour about how we're all going to die and we're doomed, and then they go, and yet the little green spark goes through the cement. There's hope. I don't know if there's hope or not, but I feel like we're a little more educated, and there are examples of that education, and yet we see the crushing. We're obviously in the boom. What I saw in Vernal during the time I wrote the book is now the boom has gone to bust again, just as Stegner said. So during the bust, you can go like, oh, it's cool, we're good, until the next boom comes. So I guess the answer is they would be depressed, but here we are in this room, and a lot of people think about this sort of thing. Yep.
So why do you live in North Carolina?
That's a great question. It's a great question. It's actually kind of I moved, as I mentioned, from Massachusetts to Colorado when I was 30, and I really didn't know until then how regional this country was. Do you guys want me to reattach this thing? Did I already?
No, you're good.
Yeah.
Yep.
I remember getting out there, not just getting healthy from cancer and stuff, but going, oh my God, I've been living under this burden of SAT scores in Ivy League colleges for 30 years. I didn't even know it. And then I'm like, woo, I'm in the West. And so of course I wrote, I'm going to stay in the West forever. And then I wrote a little book, my first published book about Cape Cod. And my dad was dying there. It was a memoir. It was called A Wild Rank Place, which is a Thoreau quote. It is a wild rank place and there's no flattery in it. And my dad was kind of a blunt Worcester businessman, and I thought he had no flattery. He was like the Cape in February. So we went back. I just got married. We went back for 3 months, and it turned into 7 years. And then finally I thought, well, I'm going to read this little thing for you. I'd taken these Stegnerian and Abbey-esque tools back to where I grew up, and I was going to use them there. So I wrote a book called Return of the Osprey. It essentially ended on this Wendell Berry-esque note. I will stay on Cape Cod forever. And some professors in North Carolina read it, and they liked it a lot, and they offered me a job. And my wife was pregnant with our first child, and suddenly the idea of health insurance and salary seemed very good. And we moved down there, and we thought we were only going to stay temporarily. And a real big moment was when we were back out here, or we were actually in Cape Cod. My daughter was about 9, and she said, I want to go home to North Carolina. And it was like, we had all this geographic uncertainty, but she had none. And we were fucked, basically. So what I've tried to do, the previous generation of nature writers, that includes somewhat Rick, even though we're about the same age, but it's more like, we used to call them Barry, Gary, and Terry. It's Wendell, Barry Lopez, Gary Snyder, and Terry Thomas Williams. There's this big movement about region and loving your region, and Stegner, in a way, was the father of this sort of movement, one of the fathers. And for me, I'm in the next generation, and what I've made do with is knowing 3 really regions pretty well. And I have this corny, hokey kind of definition of myself now as an American who tries to get I'd love to get back out here, but life has, like a lot of people, I went there for a job. And I've tried to make do. It's like an arranged marriage versus your passionate love. And I've learned a lot about the coast there and the hurricanes that are coming right now. And part of what I took back there came from Stegner. So if you have a job that pays over 100K and you want to get me out here, I'm here.
We don't.
It's a long answer, but it's what I think about the world. So I've got this great little ending part, but because you might not have heard me say this before, we're here to talk about the future of America West. I'm going to read a little longer than usual. So if you want to think about your things to do list for tomorrow or daydream, you're welcome to. I'm going to go for it. I'm not going to go for it. I'm just going to read from the end. I can't handle it. It's my wife's thing again. I don't want to put you to sleep. I'll read 2 paragraphs earlier. One that's relevant to here about, I'm going to skip. Stegner was a master of the old children's game of connecting the dots. And ours is a time for connecting the dots like none other. He handed down to us a way to talk and think about resources and jobs and land, and to consider the larger connection between economics, diverse cultures, geographies, industries, and peoples. Of course, Stegner never would have claimed to have invented these ideas whole cloth. Those who lighted the way, and this is a phrase that Wendell Berry gives me earlier in the book, he said, we always have to remember who lighted the way for us. Those who lighted his way included Bernard DeVoto and Powell, and he leaned on them just as those who have come after him have leaned on him. His books helped spread a new vocabulary of the West as a home of aridity, vast spaces, and government subsidization, and his ideas were extended, altered, and complicated by the next generation of alternative Western thinkers, turned to the field of law, for instance, by Charles Wilkinson, and toward history by Patricia Limerick, our next speaker here, and toward memoir and fiction by William Kitteridge, and toward journalism by Mark Reisner, whose book Cadillac Desert is a brilliant expose of the history of dams in the West and who everybody should be reading this summer. Even many of today's Western economists look back to Stegner. It is hard to exaggerate the spreading web of this basic construct of ideas and how much intellectual influence it had in the West. And I'll read about Abbey, skipping ahead. What he gave us was the thrill of the fight, the thrill of the physical. If we go in search of Abbey, we find he can still offer us these today. But there is something else too that makes Abbey relevant. This is his willingness to tell the truth. It is a handy tool and a lot more. Readers enjoy the thrill of transgression when he blurts something out about lust, hypocrisy, or the idiots who rankle him. He makes bluntness a high art. But there is a deeper honesty too. A willingness to say exactly what you feel, no matter the consequences, to serve the truth, even if the truth you serve promises to make you unpopular in your time. The great biographer Walter Jackson Bate wrote that one reason writers need to have recourse to writers from other times is that they help us stand firm against the fickle mores of the time in which we live. Abbey served a larger truth and wasn't willing to budge an inch to please those who wished his truth were more appealing. It is in this tough, independent way, always insisting that we shouldn't follow him, that he still serves as a model, a teacher. Other thing I say about Abbey is that he really provides it. I think we're so far away from the idea of counterculture. He really provides an example of how to live a counter life. A life where he says it relies on books. It also relies on knowing. He always said, if I write this stuff, it's not going to make me famous. It's not going to make me popular. At the same time, he was rankled that he wasn't on the #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. But he knew that writing against the powers would not make him popular with the powers. So I'll just read the last page of the book, which is about the 2 men's deaths. And spoiler alert here, they both die. in different ways. By all accounts, dying was the bravest thing that Ed Abbey ever did. The first of what would be his multiple death sentences came in the form of a false diagnosis. He was told he had pancreatic cancer and had only a few months to live. His early novels tended to feature men taking stands against the modern world and men dying brave deaths. He vowed to do the same, claiming that he wouldn't succumb to the usual modern end of a long and miserable hospital stay. He stuck to his insistence on dying well through the first long false death, and then again through his longer, more drawn-out decline from esophageal varices. Before he died, he managed to complete Hayduke Lives, the sequel to the Monkey Wrench game. It was written under a true deadline, mostly to provide for his family, and finished less than a week before his life ended. If you've read it, it's not the most literary book in the world, but you understand why, given the circumstances. When the real end came, he was ready. He vowed not to die in a hospital, and he didn't. He'd been in the hospital for 2 days already when, according to Doug Peacock, finally he pulled out all the tubes and announced, with the clearest eyes I've ever seen, that it was time to go. His wife Clark, Peacock, Jack Luffler, and another friend, Steve Prescott, hustled him out of the hospital and took him into the hills near Tucson, granting his request to die in the wilderness. The problem was that once he was out in nature, he didn't die, but recovered. The morning passed and it grew hot, and Abbey said he wanted to go home to die in his writing cabin. Abbey survived the night and the next day, buoyed by blood taken from the hospital, blood that his friends used to, quote, top him off. He was surprisingly upbeat during his last day, but the night was full of pain and coughing fits that only quieted after Peacock injected him with a mix of Demerol and Copazine. Just before dawn, with his family gathered around him, Abbey's breathing slowed, became deep and guttural, and finally stopped. For me, Abbey's death reinforces a lesson my own father first taught me. My dad, by the way, died when he was a year older than me, which seemed very old at the time. That death can be, the lesson that he taught me, that death can be one of life's most elemental and visceral experiences. I had the good fortune of being there with my father, gripping his hand as his breath slowed and his pulse faded. If there is one thing that all of Abbey's friends agree on, it's that his death was a brave one. And as I look ahead to my coming years, I think that this example might just come in handy. Stegner's death was not as dramatic as Abbey's. How could it be? Ironically, while Abbey died at home, Stegner died on the road. He was in Santa Fe for a reading and was pulling his car out onto a highway on-ramp when he was hit by another car. Mary, his wife of 50 years, was with him, but unhurt. I'm sorry, it was my fault, he whispered to her in the hospital, taking responsibility to the end. He was 84 years old. His death saddens me, but what I'm really haunted by is what Mary Stegner found when she got home. On his desk in his study was an unfinished to-do list. I think of that list now and remind myself that there are still many items that have not been checked off, that for all of us, there is still much work to do. Thank you.